welcome to the second day of the conference. I'll say good morning, but I know for some it's good evening. In this session, we are going to talk about expertise. I think as a maintained hypothesis, few would disagree with the notion that a well-functioning democracy depends on tapping the knowledge of experts. For all of us, I'm sure one of the most frightening recent developments in our democracies has been the emerging large-scale public mistrust in expertise. We can now see that mistrust playing out in the COVID-19 pandemic with literally life and death consequences. While having an informed public is clearly important for democracy, in this session, we will be primarily concerned not with how the general public becomes informed, but with how those people who are trusted by the public to make the rules become informed, namely legislators, regulators, and standard setters. Do those crafting the rules and regulations get the information and knowledge they need, or are there distortions that undermine our representative democracies? We have three speakers this morning who have thought about these issues a great deal, and perhaps, even more importantly, all three have seen up close how the sausage is made. First, I want to introduce Sarah Boom Raskin. For those who have attended the conference yesterday, you may recall that Anat promised we would have someone with a law background on every panel in the next 2 days. For this panel, Sarah fulfills that role, having gotten her JD at Harvard and now serving as a visiting professor at Duke Law School. But in addition to her knowledge of the law, Sarah brings her extensive and distinguished experience and service in government that involved financial regulation and policymaking. From 2010 to 2014, Sarah served as a governor of the Federal Reserve Board, where she dealt with the whole array of regulatory and monetary policy issues that the Fed is charged with. After that, she became the Deputy Secretary of the US Department of the Treasury. Among her many areas of concern and expertise is the cybersecurity of our financial systems. Our second panelist is Karthik Ramanna, a professor of business and public policy at the, I knew I was gonna get this wrong, Blavatnik, okay, we'll edit that in the recording, School of Government at the University of Oxford. Karthik is a PhD in management from MIT and has written articles on accounting issues and generally on how our capitalist system works and doesn't work. He is very knowledgeable about the accounting rules and specifically about how they're not always made in the public interest. He has actually written a book entitled Political Standards, Corporate Interest, Ideology, and Leadership in the Shaping of Accounting Rules for the Market Economy. Karthik's interest in improving our democracies are broad and deep. Among other things, he is director of Oxford's Management Master of Public Policy program, a one-year degree program for current and prospective leaders in government. Finally, our third member of the panel is Tommaso Valletti, a professor of economics at the Imperial College Business School, and also a professor of economics at the University of Rome. Tommaso, who has a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, has written extensively on competition and antitrust issues and has served as an academic advisor to many regulatory commissions and other policymaking bodies. Between 2016 and 2019, he was the chief competition economist of the European Commission. So as the title suggests, we're going to be focusing on thin political markets. So let me begin by asking Karthik, who introduced the term thin political markets, to tell us what a thin political market is and why it is problematic.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm delighted to be here with Tommaso and Sarah to talk about this issue. I think a good place to start is perhaps where we left off at yesterday's conversation, where we talked very briefly about the classic collective action problem, one that social scientists have described for, gosh, well over 60, 70 years now, which basically involves at its simplest form, a concentrated commercial interest on one side and a diffuse general interest on the other. And the idea is that when you set up a political system like that, then of course the concentrated commercial interest is better informed, better rallies around the issues, and therefore more likely to prevail in the political process. And there's been actually a fair bit of work amongst political scientists and amongst economists that have been looking at the conditions that result in this kind of collective action problem and looking importantly at how to mitigate those conditions. And for instance, institutions, the way institutions are designed can play an important role in mitigating them. The media can play an important role in mitigating them. The next panel is on the media, so we can pick up on that theme. And so that's sort of the basic problem that we've set out for a while now. When I started studying the world of how accounting rules are made some 20 years ago now, I was struck that these two conditions were not simply fully descriptive of the nature of the problem. And it appeared that there were two other elements to the problem that seemed to keep cropping up. The first was that when you talk about the concentrated commercial interest, it brought a certain degree of quite actually valuable expertise to the table. And that expertise was not the sort of expertise you would characterize as conceptual knowledge or explicit knowledge that, the sort of knowledge that, say, a professor brings to the classroom and says, here is the theory, or here's the analytical framework. Rather, it was a sort of experiential knowledge or tacit knowledge. It was knowledge that comes from learning by doing. Because the nature of the kind of rules that were being set here, they were trying to anticipate, in some sense, the practice on the ground. They were rules to define behavior around emerging areas of the economy. So they depended heavily on this sort of experiential expertise. But the problem was that the people who brought that experiential expertise were the concentrated commercial interest. So that was one element of the problem, the co-location of the interest and this tacit knowledge amongst the individuals who were in the room. The second area that perhaps categorized this was that the kind of issues we were talking about are sort of relatively low salience. And by that, I mean, quite simply, they were fairly boring issues. So I made a career studying accounting rules, and I learned very quickly not to tell people in cocktail parties that that's what I did, because it sort of drives people away. And in fact, I remember when I went on my very first date with a person who eventually became my husband, I made it a very keen point not to tell him what I did for a living, because I thought, oh my God, then there will never be a second date. But I want to drive home the point that the nature of some of these issues are truly esoteric, they're arcane. And they're the sort of things that therefore don't excite the media, they don't excite the politicians. When I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of my neighbors on the street was Senator Warren. Now, Elizabeth Warren has made a career out of going after financial institutions. She's been quite vocal about that. But I think even Elizabeth Warren doesn't run political campaigns about accounting rules, right? So there's a limit to how much even a politician who is deeply invested in these sorts of issues will politicize or popularize the underlying nature of the problem. And so when you put these conditions together, the co-location of the experiential expertise or the tacit knowledge with the commercial interest, and the fact that these are fairly low salience, arcane, even boring issues to the vast majority of people, you create the conditions where you have what I call a thin political market. And I'll just very quickly make it vivid with an example. So on the 14th of January, 2009, this was still sort of the height of the financial crisis, the 2008-2009 financial crisis. There was a lot going on, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the economy. The new Obama administration was to take office shortly, and so on. A pretty important change happened in the world of accounting on the 14th of January, 2009. There is in accounting what's called a conceptual framework, which is sort of like a constitution for accounting standards. It basically lays out the principles by which accounting standards on specific issues like revenue recognition or goodwill or leases, those are the principles by which they must adhere. And on the 14th of January, 2009, when the whole world was in the middle of this financial crisis, the standard setting boards for accounting, both in the United States and internationally, what's called the International Accounting Standards Board that's based here in London, decided to eliminate two words from its constitution, the word reliability and the word verifiability. They basically said that accounting standards do not have to have properties of reliability and verifiability. Now, if you imagine a change of that magnitude happening at any time, that would seem like it would be a pretty big deal. For it to happen in the middle of the financial crisis, that should be an even bigger deal. But that was not in the news at all. In fact, what was in the news, I just checked before this, what was on the news on the 15th of January? Turned out that was the day when we had the miracle on the Hudson. Remember that plane that landed on the Hudson River in New York? So that's what we talked about. Now you think about, in the scheme of things, what has mattered more to our world? The miracle on the Hudson or the change or the drop in the words reliability and verifiability from accounting's constitution? I think, we might all have sort of a sense of where I'm going with this. So basically, I think the issue is that you've got very few people that are in the room that set the discussion. They all sort of tend to think alike because they all come from the same sort of background, the same commercial interest. But there isn't really a single villain in this, right? Because nobody's an expert on everything. So on different issues, different people show up and nobody's there to challenge them. And that pretty much sets how the rules are decided. That's what I call a thin political market.
So thank you for that. The observation I would simply make is that we like to make heroes of our pilots, and when the accounting standard setters are not heroes, we just sweep that under the rug, unfortunately. So that's an interesting confluence of events on that day. So the next thing I want to do is turn to Sarah here, who has, again, a former member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve and also serving in the Treasury as a Deputy Secretary, has been involved heavily in financial regulation. And just to pick up on what Karthik said, I would guess that the financial crisis in 2008 arguably made the need for good financial regulation much more salient to the public, or at least should have. So perhaps the salience was there, but the issues have remained exceedingly complex and are probably about as boring, no offense, Karthik, as the accounting issues. So they're not easily understood by the public, clearly. So based on your experience, Sarah, how do you see critical financial regulation and policy making being affected by thin political markets? What has been your experience?
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. And Karthik, I think you really lay out here this notion that has broad applicability, this idea of thin political markets, because it clearly is playing a role, not just in the accounting realm, but we've seen it time and time again in the financial regulatory space. And all the characteristics that Karthik points out, this idea of concentrated commercial interest, the idea of, tacit knowledge and low salience, they all combine to apply really in the financial regulatory space, both in the world of regulation and in the world of monetary policy, which is also this realm that is quite inaccessible to most people, and yet touches people and needs to be understood in a way that is going to produce good outcomes. So, pragmatically speaking, it's almost like a garbage in, garbage out kind of problem, right? So the policy outcomes are going to match the input. If the input is somehow flawed, incomplete, not comprehensive, what we're going to see come out of the process is a policy that is compromised, incomplete, filled with gaps, and potentially suboptimal. So the inputs are extraordinarily important. And what this panel is highlighting through this notion of a thin political market is the idea that the regulators are taking in pieces of data that they are going to be using in the regulatory process to craft the right kind of policy guidance, rules, regulations, processes. And that whole way of taking in data is critically important to getting on the other side the right outcomes. Now, to just apply, again, Karthik's ideas here of the importance of what is coming in. I think back to a rule that the Dodd-Frank Act required the Fed to produce, okay? And it was a rule regarding interchange fees, okay? Interchange fees, maybe more accessible to people than some of the other things that the Fed has had to do. But essentially, they're charges in the credit card context between the merchant and the credit card company. And there's a whole host of fees and relationships that go into this process. But the Congress said, as part of the Dodd-Frank Act, that they wanted the Fed to figure out what the right interchange fee would be. And essentially, the Fed then engaged in a rulemaking process by which it gathered up comments. And I think the way in which it did this is completely illustrative of both the thin political markets that we have and the importance of correcting for them. So essentially, you can imagine what comes in through a process that calls on comments to help formulate what is the right interchange fee. Now, when the comments were compiled, it turns out they were thousands. I mean, thousands and thousands of comments came in, and they came in at such a pace that they were, that certain rounds and extensions had to be made. So the question is opened up to the public: what should the interchange fee be? Thousands of comments come in the prescribed periods of time, and they start to get cataloged by the staff. And as you look through what actually comes in substantively, you see that even though there have been these thousands of inputs, the categories are roughly 3, okay? So most of these comments are saying the same thing, sometimes verbatim, by the way, because trade groups will actually ask that the template be used. And so you're just seeing verbatim copies of the exact same comment, and that's one stack. And then you'll have another stack where you actually have some unusual people who don't usually comment in this space making a comment, and it's quite unique. And then you'll have a third category, also much smaller than the first, where you also are bringing in some interesting perspectives. But you end up not reading everything because there's only these 3 categories or so. And when you read them, you see that they are extraordinarily lopsided, that essentially they are skewing way in favor of the particular entities involved, the credit card companies, the merchants. These turn out to be where you've got most of the comments, and you've got some consumers, and then you've got some, potentially, ad hoc kind of remarks. So this then becomes the exercise. You have to take these comments after they've been categorized and figure out how to sew them into a good policy. But the point is, and we can, we don't have to talk about like what actually happened to the interchange fee rule, but suffice it to say that the process was critically important, and it was a lopsided one. And as a lopsided one, you needed internally at the Fed to make corrections regarding, what perspectives were missing, and those gaps needed to get filled. So that is, I think, one example of this notion of thin political markets. It applies, though, across the board. I've seen it play out not just in the interchange fee context, but in the context of every new rule that had to get promulgated pursuant to Dodd-Frank. And it also applies in the realm more generally of the financial regulatory apparatus as it's conducted by more than just the Fed. So let me stop there.
Let's turn to another area that is quite complex and requires deep expertise. And that, of course, is competition policy and antitrust enforcement. Tommaso, as a former chief competition economist at the European Commission and advisor, obviously, to many bodies on this topic, what problems do you see that have been created by thin political markets that you've witnessed in your experience?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Anat, for organizing this very interesting conference and for having me on the panel. So antitrust fits 100% the notion of a very thin political market. I should say that antitrust is becoming these days also an exciting area in different respects, probably because now it's a bit less thin than it was in the past. So there is lots of issues which have come to the attention of a general public, and that's good. And so there is a change in the perception, in the discussion, and we are witnessing this right now, both in Europe, in the United States, but also in Asia. Even China announced a few weeks ago a new antitrust law which applies to big tech. So things are happening. But I want to bring my personal experience. I'm an academic. Then I did this job as chief economist for 3 years, and then I'm back to academia after that tenure. And I was a sausage maker for those 3 years. So I've seen the things from the inside. And as an academic, I thought that perhaps we, the experts, could shape the right answers to how to design an institution, how to find solutions to specific problems. And this is my personal experience. I cannot overgeneralize, but I have to say that I came into that job with some priors, which I had to revise afterward, because I understood that we academics in general are subject to influence, to capture as anyone else. So we cannot be this special breed of people which are outside the general world. So the job in Brussels was interesting. The setup is you have a person from the outside, typically an academic, who enters an organization at the top. So I was in charge of all the economic analysis of cases, and I was giving the advice to the ultimate decision maker, which is the commission on the economics. She would get similar advice from the head of a legal service. She would talk to the case team, and then she would take specific decisions. Those decisions were related to big firms. So you may know the Google antitrust cases we had in Europe over 3 years, but it was also mergers between giants such as Bayer and Monsanto, Dow and DuPont, even our own giants like Armstrong and Siemens. So these are multi-billion mergers that involve a lot of money and a lot of interest from the corporations. It took me obviously a while, having been catapulted into a world that was a bit, I wasn't familiar to it. It took me a while to understand, but after a while, I did see that there was a regular script that was going on. And basically I saw that the script, basically there were 3 types of agents: the lawyers, the consultants, and the enforcers. And that was it, okay? There was no one else. Academics out. I will mention academics. The very few academics that would be there would be part of the consultants, okay? So some very senior academic would be part of the consultant, no junior academic to be seen ever, something we may want to comment on later on. But the basic gatekeeper would be the law firms, okay? So the main actor are the law firms. Then the law firms would call the economic consultants, and the consultants may or may not have some good, well-known academic behind them, and obviously the enforcers. So these are the 3 players that would meet regularly at workshops, seminars organized daily, I'm not exaggerating, by think tanks. And that was a novelty to me. The role of think tank and some special places that I wasn't particularly familiar with, and they were organizing, and then it took me a while to realize who was behind the famous think tanks. Again, a point of reflection. Think tanks that would typically lack the disclosure of the funding, for instance, a very obvious problem, but the whole script, as I said, was setting a scene where the lawyers and the consultants would, talk about something related to a merger or to a conduct case, having the enforcers listening to them, and perhaps making points that the common wisdom on a certain topic, the received wisdom was, in a certain direction, which was a surprise to me as an academic, because I heard use and abuse of economics that was quite a serious issue when I was at the commission in Brussels. And by the way, when I talk about Brussels, the same is happening in DC. There is no difference. So I had to go to DC several times every year, and the same kind of script would be happening there too. So in that sense, Europe and the United States are not different whatsoever. So the novelty from my side was the use of these think tanks that would make sure that people would meet to listen to some particular narratives. And these narratives were always to ensure that the status quo would be preserved, okay? Patting our shoulders, saying everything is going fine, don't fret, nothing to be changed. But things were changing. Things were changing. So we had been witnessing for the past 20, 30 years an increase in market concentration at the industrial level at least. We have been witnessing for the past 30 years an increase in margins using detailed plant level data. So that is the ability of firms to price above cost. That's a notion of market power. We have witnessing historically an increase in the share that goes to profit, the share of GDP that goes to profits. And the other side of the same coin is that we have also witnessing a decrease in the labor share of GDP. So there's no trickle down. So profits are being made, but they don't go to the workers. And there's also witnessing in general rising inequalities within countries. Okay? This is the general scene. And again, as an academic, as a person curious of what's happening to the economy, I was reading what some research was producing, and I was bringing this into the debates in our small community, in our very thin political market. And the reaction from inside the elite of this antitrust elite was always to find defensive, okay? Never open to a discussion. The idea was always to get rid of anything that could challenge the status quo. And the role of the think tanks was precisely this, to make sure that for any research idea that was coming from outside the community that could have been vetted, could have been published in some outstanding journal, there would be some working paper, some pamphlet produced by some without any vetting to make sure that the enforcers, who are not academics, they cannot evaluate the pros and cons of publication, would hear that, yes, paper A is saying this, but paper B is saying that. So the decision is out there. We don't know yet. The jury is still out there to make a decision. And so don't fret. Let's wait a little bit more. In the meantime, decisions had to be made. And that was the purpose, to make sure that decisions wouldn't be affected by this change. So I said I came into the job with some priors which I had to revise. And I had to revise my priors on the use of economics, on the use of economics into antitrust. So a little bit of history, just 1 minute. Historically, economics had not been used until the 80s. Then there was a sort of revolution, Chicago, post-Chicago. We started using a lot of economics in antitrust for the better, I would hope. And the economists were a bit arrogant, saying, before us, it was hand-waving. Now we can measure things. We can with the principles. We can give you the tests. But the outcome of this has been a very narrow set of boxes, of categories that economists have invented. These are called, the SNP test for market definition. Some very curious emphasis on efficiency only, which is called, the as efficient competitor test, the margin squeeze. Or you would have some models of merger simulation, which are very specific models of competition with horizontally differentiated products, and that's about it. And these boxes have been completely hijacked by the lawyers and the economists who learned exactly how to use them, irrespective of the realities that were going around us. So we stopped thinking, we stopped asking ourselves, why are we doing this? Does it work? What does it mean? What does it mean for prices, for markets, for industries, for competition? We didn't know. So economics has been, I think, rather damaging to the way we've done our job in the profession in such a narrow sense. When I was doing the job, and this is the last comment I made, I was contacted by several of these consultancies if I wanted to become one of their advisors at the end of a job, okay? Because if I can play with words, this is not just a thin market, it's an ultra thin market with a very skinny market which sits on very fat rents. So you have to know the figures. If you are a good academic, an established academic with a knowledge of the system, you would command fees which are probably, I don't know, $1,500 an hour. So in a day, you can make $12,000. That's a lot of money for an individual in a single day. Why? Because these deals are worth billions for the companies, hundreds of millions for the CEOs, tens of millions for the consultants. This is what it is. It's the money. It's the money. And this is why competition policy and financial markets are very similar, and accounting, because there is so much money at stake. So when I was asked whether I want to become one of those consultants, I said no, because I thought I want to preserve my integrity, my ability to say what I think. But then the other side, they even offered a retainer fee. So they pay you for future services. And I said, no, I'm not very interested, thank you. And they thought that as an economist, I was trying just to push up my price. So perhaps I'm not such a good economist, because I said I'm acting on principles and values, and they didn't understand. Thanks.
So thank you for that. Actually, thank all three of you for these very important observations. Tommaso, I want to come back to the issues that you've raised, because I think they're very important, in particular because a lot of us are academics attending this conference, and I think we do have a huge responsibility to work for the greater good. So let me just say the following. The importance of what we're doing here is not only to highlight problems, which we obviously have done here with the thin political markets, but to try to find some solutions. And so what I'm going to do is put each of you on the spot and ask you, if you had a magic wand or could somehow be the benevolent dictator for our world, what changes would you make in the system? Sarah, let me start with you. What changes would you make?
Sure. So first of all, on the academics, the listening to Tommaso talk about the role of academics, I think is just filled with possibility here. And Tommaso, I think you said it just perfectly when you said the key question is, why are we doing this? Okay, so what we need to do is really figure out a way in which we can bring this absolutely critical academic research to bear on the questions of the day, right? So essentially, we know that the academic research is going to cast a very important light in the comment-making process. And yet, at the same time, it is, for the reasons Tommaso described, quite compromised and quite flawed. And to go back to what we were talking about earlier, sort of the idea of like kind of garbage in, garbage out, if we aren't taking in the right inputs here, from a process perspective, we are not going to end up with optimal policy solutions. So the academic research piece, I think, needs some important focus. I'm not sure I have the exact way to get this about, but the goals, I think, are twofold on the academic side. One is figuring out how the expertise of the academic gets applied to the challenge. And I think that burden sits with the academic in part, to take the expertise and figure out in its most broad form how it gets applied to the question at hand. The second thing I would say on the academic side is to somehow reduce the fear and improve the boldness. One of the reactions I've had in reviewing academic work that comes in on the comment-making process is that it tends to be caveated, narrow, extremely circumscribed, so that its applicability turns out to be quite minimal. We have to figure out a way to open up a kind of boldness that the academic can take in presenting the research, because again, I think it is critical, and if it can be done if it can be done well, it will improve the outcome. And it may be, by the way, one of the most important pieces in improving the outcome. But the academic research piece, I think, is critical. Let me name a couple of other things, Paul, that I think could help in this category of like what we need to do to actually improve things. The comment periods that are used, okay, when I talk about the comment periods, what I'm referring to are the periods required by law that the regulatory agencies open up the question at hand to the public, okay? And we talked about how the regulators aren't getting good input from the public, and as a result, our outcomes are being compromised. I think more imagination is required in this comment period. I think the regulators need to be thinking about how to formulate the questions in a way that isn't going to turn off huge swaths of the public. That I think is on the regulator to figure out, on the agency to figure out how to break down the question. And again, we're talking about very technical matters, but break down the question to its public interest essence, to its common good essence. That's on the regulator, on the agency to actually articulate. So I think that's a very important piece. I'd also like to see some weighing more heavily on subject matter expertise rather than government relations. We had a very interesting report actually on the linkages between climate change and financial stability come out of one of the regulatory bodies, the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And what was really interesting about that report is it contained a whole host, quite comprehensive participation in this discussion of what are the linkages between financial stability, market risk, financial cost, and climate change. And what I wanted to find out most profoundly was who were these people making the recommendations? Was it the same olds? One important thing that was learned is that it was not government relations people. It was subject matter expertise. So in other words, if say, a fossil fuel company was participating in this report, they didn't send in their lobbyist, their government relations person. They sent in their scientist, or they sent in their climate economist. It was a different kind of endeavor that wasn't scripted through the lobbyists, through the government relations people. I think that helps in producing good policy outcomes. And again, most of the things that the regulatory agencies see come through government relations people. And I'm not slamming government relations people. They play an important role. But when it comes to creating policy, we may want to figure out ways in which we lean more heavily on the subject matter experts. Finally, I would note that there's got to be a way to essentially scramble the questions to pull in expertise from unlikely sources. We have to be more imaginative in drawing out essentially what the public interest rationale is for what public rationale exists for the policy in question. And sometimes to do that, you have to scramble the questions so that you pull in atypical commenters. And I will stop there. There is a lot of work, Paul, to be done on this, but it's extremely interesting. And I would argue time well spent thinking about, because at the end of the day, I think it will work to improve policy outcomes.
Sarah, when you talked about so much of the basically advice or commentary coming in from academics being so qualified with caveats and everything, I couldn't help but think of Harry Truman's quote, "Give me a one-handed economist." So we always have economists talking about on the other hand and on the other hand. And Tommaso, I'm going to come back because I know you have some opinions about that as well. But let me just go to Karthik and give you the magic wand to wave What would you see as potentially some important things to do to change the structure of how we conduct business to get better expertise on a level playing field coming into the process?
So I think I've been thinking about this along 4 dimensions, and the broad sort of takeaway from my remarks will be that there's no silver bullet solution. It's going to take a coordinated effort across a number of different initiatives to make things work. The first of these is around norms, and in particular, the norms around how managers engage in these sorts of processes. And here I will make the distinction between managers and corporations. I tend to be fairly skeptical of the idea that we will somehow repurpose corporations to be something other than profit-seeking entities. But I think that managers in those corporations, as Sarah alluded to earlier when she said, the scientists who work in those corporations, they're citizens. They might see these things differently. Even the government affairs people are citizens, and they might see these things differently. But really, there is a role here for emphasizing the responsibility of people who are in positions of expertise to act as citizens when they are in this kind of unrivaled position of power. This is not an unprecedented idea. This is an idea that's as old as civilization itself. But we've been doing less and less of teaching around this idea, particularly in leadership schools, like business schools, schools of government, schools of law, et cetera. And maybe we should be spending a little more time on building the norms of citizenship, particularly in the context of privilege. As educators, it strikes me that that's a place to start. The second dimension is around laws, and I think that there are a number of sort of low-hanging fruit here. I know tomorrow we've got a panel which includes some prosecutors, but one of the questions for us is, can we prosecute cases of quid pro quo where you've got someone who was involved in setting, regulatory standards, but then subsequently took on, say, a retainer, as Tommaso was offered, right? Can we go after the people who were unprincipled? Is there a case to be made there? I understand that there are some complexities with the McDonald v. US case that might complicate prosecutions in those sorts of scenarios. But it'd be great to hear from lawyers as to what we can do in that space. But even if we don't go after prosecutions, we can just improve on some of the institutions here. So for instance, there's a staff rotation program at both the Securities and Exchange Commission as well as the Financial Accounting Standards Board, where members of the big 4 audit firms rotate in for usually a year or 2 years to serve in a public interest role. If they're in the SEC, they're effectively public servants. The FASB is a not-for-profit charity. But during the period of this public service, they continue to be on the benefits plans of their big 4 employers. To me, that strikes me as sort of an unusual arrangement that, you would be in a regulatory body that oversees the big 4, but your benefits are paid by the big 4. It seems like that's low-hanging fruit right there. Maybe we can fix that. I think that there is actually a big role for the media to play in these issues. In the next panel, we'll hear from Jonathan Ford. He and his colleague Madison Marriage, I think they did a great job 2-3 years ago by going after the audit firms, in the FT, almost week after week in the context of the Carillion scandal here in the UK. It's very hard, I'd imagine, to keep the pressure up on your editors, to keep writing articles about, auditing scandals and accounting scandals and so forth. I think it might be interesting to hear from Jonathan about, sort of, to the extent that he's willing to talk about it, what was the internal politics of that? Or Martin Wolf, who's on this call, might be able to speak to that as well. How do you get brave journalists to keep up the reporting on issues like this? And I think the final thing is really what I would call a separation of powers argument. How do we upskill government to be, in some sense, and public servants to be, in some sense, the countervailing forces here? Not in the sense that they will bring the specialist expertise, but again, to what Sarah was saying, so that they can be good generalists, so that they can ask the right questions of experts. So my day job, as you mentioned, Paul, is director of the Oxford MPP. And one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing is I think it's really important to work with future government leaders and teach them, what is good accounting, what is good finance, just so that they can ask the right questions when the bankers are in the room. And I think that, if we combine these four approaches about norms, business managers, the laws, particularly going after low-hanging fruit, salience through the media, and then separation of powers by upskilling government to ask the right questions, we start to get to a solution on this space.
So thank you. I'm just about to open it up for questions from the audience. And so anyone in the audience who wants to submit a question can do it on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Again, we're going to have to apologize. We're not going to be able to get to all questions. But I want to ask Tommaso. He wrote a piece in ProPublica, actually ProMarkets, I'm sorry, just a couple of months ago. And I think you took umbrage about the fact that academics are often saying we need more research, that it's time for us to keep quiet until all the jury is basically in because of research. And one of the questions I already see coming from the audience turns out to be a question that's sort of along this. What can we do to give incentives to academics to speak up, even when they can't do definitively? But I think, as you said in your article, when we're 70% confident that this is the solution, and we shouldn't wait until we're 99% confident. So Tommaso, I'll give you a chance to answer that, and then open it a little bit more generally to this idea of what can we do to give academics more incentive to speak from the science and inform the process.
Sure, thank you, Paul. And that piece you mentioned started as a Sunday morning thread on Twitter that Luigi Zingales saw. I said, why don't you write a whole piece about it? So it was kind of fun. And I even said, policy by definition is uncertain. You have to take decisions with imperfect information and in finite time. That's what you have to do. You have to decide on a merger, you have to decide on a regulation, you've got a timeline, you've got 3 months ahead of you, and on balance, you have to make the choice that you think is the right one. So waiting until the definite results are found is going to be impossible. So the example I made is now we are through this horrible pandemic, and we don't have the definitive answers that wearing a mask is helpful, but for God's sake, wear it because it's so important. Because if we wait for the final results, it may just be too late. Okay, and the cost of wearing a mask is so little, and the benefits are potentially so large. So when it comes to antitrust, the incentives in academia are distorted. In academia, in my field at least, which is a very conservative field, industrial organization, it takes you 5-7 years to publish a paper, which is a structural I/O model of something. And if you don't have the data, you're not going to work on the topic itself, which meant that we didn't look at the big tech problem because the big tech never released any data to anyone to do independent vetting of what was going on, which is a paradox since they are sitting on such wealth of data. So the solution is, there are some suggestions I have, but I think the first solution in antitrust has to come from politics, because it's important that we have to clarify the purpose of the law. You are in the US, the Sherman Act, 1890. The purpose of the act was basically to try to reduce power. So that's the very American tradition that you seem to have lost with time. And so you have to, through the Congress, through the normal way of discussing politics. And this is why it's an exciting moment now. There's also change in administration. In this change of administration, you have to be very vigilant on the appointments. There are key appointments which are going to be made, and you want to make sure that the right people are going to get there. So by the way, the problems with antitrust enforcement or the very little things we've done in the past 20 years are not a problem of Trump. They started with Obama. They have a long history, so they are bipartisan, unfortunately. And that's something you have to think about. Now, the new discussion is coming from not the usual suspects. It's not coming from the Department of Justice. It's not coming from the Federal Trade Commission. These are the guys who belong to the antitrust elite. It's coming from the outside. It's coming from the House Antitrust Subcommittee. It's coming from the state AGs, which are doing a lot of activities. It's coming in lots of interesting different ways, but not from inside the profession. The profession has been extremely conservative. I think we should reorganize the agencies. So you will have to have economists, you will have also to have labor economists, because we have ignored the impact of competition on workers, for instance. You will have to get the views of sociologists, of anthropologists. In my job as an enforcer, and this goes back to a comment that Sarah made, I really, because by nature we are curious people, and I was dealing with super interesting cases, and I wanted to understand what was going on. I mentioned Bayer Monsanto, $66 billion of a merger, which was to be transformative in the agrochemical industry. I never spoke to a scientist. Okay, I never spoke to a scientist, because the gatekeepers are the lawyers. Only people which are trained in a certain way can talk to you, and then they know which language to talk in front of the agency. I learned nothing. I learned nothing by working for months and months on that, apart from some numbers, some market share, etc. But I didn't learn anything about an industry that could have been super interesting for me. As an industrial economist, I want to learn about the industries, but I couldn't talk to the people who were real experts, because we weren't. Okay, the lawyers weren't, the scientists were, and I couldn't get access to them. In academia, I think we need to do several things. We need to talk to our gatekeepers, which are our publications, our editors of the key journals. We need to be open. We need to be open and less parochial, less, we're defending our own turf all the time. In finance, you work with some assumptions. In industrial organization, with some other assumptions. In IO, we must do structural models. In finance, you have to talk about corporate governance. If we apply the same bar from each field and we combine these things together, I think the bar is too high and nobody is going to ever publish. Instead, we should be open to interesting ideas. It may take time to get to the right level of vetting we want to have in general, but we need to be open to ideas, and we have to accept papers. And I've seen too many papers with good ideas that have been rejected by the top 5 because they didn't have the killer identification strategy, and that's a pity. That's a pity, because we're losing on the ideas, okay? On the ideas which are very important for us. The lack of incentive is also, if you're a junior person, you don't want to be involved with this consulting business because it's a waste of time. You need to publish. However, what you do in your research may have an impact. So we have to give value to the impact of research, which means publish in the language of a layperson, but not your paper. It's not just a version of your special paper, because your paper is going to be too special. But you thought about a topic for a long time, so you should take stance. What you said earlier, Paul, is the 70% kind of thing. You thought about topic. As economists with many hands, we are trained to construct models which are counterintuitive. That's the way we publish. That's the way we do something which no one ever thought about. But when you do policy, it doesn't need to be something smart. It has to be something useful. So we need to give recognition to these things. However, they're not going to be published, and they're not going to be funded. There's a huge funding problem there, and it's not a level playing field. All these research centers, or alleged research centers I told you, they're not into the academic game of publishing. Have in mind something called the Global Antitrust Institute at George Mason University, or the Center for Law and Economics in Portland, Oregon. These are centers which are funded by the big tech, the Google, the Koch brothers, etc., who produce pamphlets. They are ready to go in front of the FTC, the DOJ, whatever hearing there is, and they produce as if they are the repository of economic knowledge, because we, the real economists, they don't even know that there is a hearing ongoing in front of the Department of Justice. And I may go there as a private individual. I'm not organized back to collective action. Among independent thinkers, we're not organized because we are doing our teaching, our research, etc. Instead, there are institutions who go there in front of the enforcers, and the enforcers are not academics. They are not meant to read every volume of the American Economic Review or the JP. That's not their job. But there is nobody helping them to distill a knowledge that, as a professor, we think that on balance we stand there as a profession, but to do it well, not just to do sometimes a quick survey among ourselves. And this doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. This organization simply doesn't organize it because nobody can pay for it. So maybe there's going to be some model too, but we need to give incentives to the younger people to engage with bigger questions, but they will do that only if we allow them sometimes to publish. Otherwise, we lose an entire generation of very smart people that, at least in my field, and that was a problem with the big tech, they didn't have the data, they ignored the problem for 20 years because they knew they couldn't publish anything. And what did they do? They concentrated on low-fat yogurts, because also ready-to-eat cereals, because in industrial organization, we have this amazing data set with scanner data for 20 years, and we've been working on just data sets, and that's about it. But this is very narrow, I think. It's too narrow, and it's not progress in our understanding of things.
So we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. This one is directed to Karthik. How do we make sure that the public interest is represented even in the low salient issues of policymaking? Do you have any examples from the accounting world that would possibly lead the way or shed some light on this?
So I think, like I said, the most impressed I've been by sort of the public being rallied around accounting issues has been here in the UK, particularly over the course of 2018, when 2018-2019, there was a sustained series of almost weekly articles in the FT about the Big Four and their role in the collapse of a company here called Carillion. Carillion was a very large public services outsourcer in the UK. So they were very visible in the public eye because, they would be responsible for all kinds of basic services that citizens would access. And then the company spectacularly collapsed very, very quickly. It turned out that all four of the Big Four were involved in some way, either in auditing or in consulting or in other ways supporting the company. And the company had been engaged in a series of really risky acquisitions on the basis of which they paid out dividends and bonuses, and then of course were left with non-performing public service contracts, so they collapsed. Now that created a lot of furor, and the FT went after them, and there was a sustained period of coverage. There were 3 parliamentary reviews, or 3 government reviews, one of which was parliamentary, the other 2 were from other parts of the government. So there was a lot of action there. And then, of course, COVID hit. And just when we were supposed to create a new accounting regulator in this country, because the idea was the previous one could not be fixed, COVID hit, and then it sort of dropped off the headline, no longer a priority. I don't know whether it's going to get picked up again, but we were so close.
So I may get criticized for asking this question because it's going to take us rather far afield, perhaps. But both Sarah and Karthik made, this is a question from the audience, observations that those inside corporations are also citizens and are affected by the policy potentially in their role as citizens. And that raises the question about governance, and perhaps gets back to Milton Friedman and that ongoing debate as to whether governance should be simply directed at maximizing profits. And of course, all the issues of stakeholder capitalism and these things. But given that these thin markets, thin political markets are affected by the actions of managers, basically, of the special interests, and given that these are citizens and affected by policy, and to the extent that their narrow interests undermine capitalism, can we in any way rely on a more expansive notion about what their responsibilities are that go beyond just the immediate short-term profits of their companies? So maybe just a little bit more discussion on that, whether there's any mileage to be gotten by appealing to managers and others as citizens and having to respond to bigger issues than just the bottom line.
Yeah, let me start with that. It's a great question. And one way I think that appeal to the citizenship of the employee could get made is really it really comes down to credibility. I have to say, as somebody who has been on the receiving end of reading comment upon comment that gets submitted, that gets submitted in the context of a rulemaking, I can say that you know when you see a genuinely compelling argument, and I would say that firms do themselves so many more favors in their own advocacy when they unleash the ability of the people within their walls to insert comments, to put in perspectives that essentially ring true. And so I think one way, Paul, to your question, which comes from the audience, is how to unlock that kind of possibility is one to just appeal really to basic credibility. I mean, I think a comment, no matter who it comes from, is going to be more credible if it has a kind of the ring of authenticity. You let essentially the person speak, his or her perspective, and the reader of that comment will take that into account, and I think we'll find the the ability of the firm to sort of let the speaker speak quite compelling.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I mean, I just want to sort of make the distinction between emphasizing on managers as citizens versus corporations. I think it's a pretty big leap to then imagine the corporation will perform the role of a citizen, of an informed citizen. That's where you get into the questions of governance and CSR and so forth. That's, I think, a whole different conversation. But for 30, 40 years in leadership schools, we have basically not said much, if anything, to graduates about their responsibilities as citizens, about the responsibilities of privilege that come from being, say, part of the Oxford community or the Harvard community or the Stanford community. And I think that there is sort of a role for that kind of emphasis, which is perhaps separate from the CSR debate, which is a different debate.
So again, we've got some excellent questions from the audience, but I want to, and I'll come back to perhaps some of those, and apologies if I'm not going to get back to all of them, but we have some special panelists that would like to ask some questions, and I want to start out with Martin Wolf, who has a number of questions. And before doing that, I wanted to recommend to everyone that you read his excellent article today in the FT about Milton Friedman, something that came up a few moments ago in the conversation. So, Martin, do you have a chance to? Here's a chance to ask some of the questions. I know you've got several.
I think this has been a really fascinating, if incredibly depressing, conversation. I'd like to make, since it came up after I asked the question, just a comment before, in response to the issue Karthik raised, which I know will be returned to in subsequent discussion with my colleagues Jonathan and Madison, because I think it's very relevant to both discussions. And it was a question I was going to ask, which was, what, if any, role does the media play in the sort of regulatory discussions you are considering? Obviously, the great majority of the media have neither any knowledge nor any interest in such subjects. The FT is obviously a bit of an exception. Even so, we have very limited resources and limited space. So a lot of the very technical discussions you're entering into, we don't cover, but we cover more of this probably, I would say, than certainly any other newspaper in the English language. And since I'm not quite sure the Wall Street Journal is a newspaper, I will put that to one side. The interesting point in reply to Karthik is that we have decided that investigative journalism is an essential part of our business and our strategy. We have put a lot of resources into it now for ever since the 15 years since the last editor was there. And we've done a lot of pretty famous investigations now. Most famous by far is the Wirecard investigation, which involved our journalists being threatened with prison and a few other exciting things. We think it's our role socially and politically, but we also think it's a great business opportunity. And though the editor came under tremendous pressure in such things, our former editor, and I assume our present editor, is absolutely committed to it. So that, I think, that's the answer to Karthik's question, but Jonathan will talk about it in greater detail. I've already mentioned this issue of the media's role and how you see that. I have two other questions. It seems to me that the government agencies are extraordinarily passive in obtaining top-class professional, academic, and other advice. To put it bluntly, why doesn't the government or governmental institutions pay for it? Why don't you have major think tanks and research institutions of your own? Is this a budgetary issue, or is there something else going on? The nakedness of governments when confronted with these very heavily these lobbies seems just to be ridiculous, given the staggering scale of the resources governments actually dispose of. So it's something very peculiar there. It's as though governments are deliberately disarming themselves. The second question I had, and it's related, is, do you think it makes a difference if the government agency or the governmental institution making these decisions is a technical bureaucracy like the Fed, or the Competition Directorate of the EU, or politicians, political ministers, legislators? How much difference does that make in the decision-making process? Because I've tended to assume the former group will be far better able to handle these sorts of issues than the latter. That's it.
Can I have a go, Paul? Okay, so thank you, Martin, for very interesting questions. So the government has huge responsibilities. I'm European. The first responsibility comes from the funding to universities. So this is an historical lack of funds to universities, which means the universities themselves, including my own, they have to look for our own research money. And the research money often comes from the very same corporations we would like to make analysis of. So this creates another layer of conflict of interest, not just in economics or business, but in pharmaceuticals, etc. So if funding of basic research was completely independent, I believe that some of these problems wouldn't exist. Second observation is that, yes, it's a budgetary issue, but it's not just a budgetary issue, because obviously, if you heard earlier when I was saying that a top economic expert can command $12,000 in a day of work, and sometimes cases last for months. So clearly, these resources are not available to agencies. You may want to increase resources to agencies, but there is another conflict of interest which exists, is that especially if you want to do a little bit of soul searching, analyze whether your decisions are correct, you have a lack of incentives from within the organization to do self-criticism. At the European Commission, where I was working, by statute, we had to do every year a couple of ex post assessments, so soul searching. Let's look at a couple of cases so that we can learn. And I thought in one case it was, okay, as an economist, let's look at where we think there may be a problem, but also where there may be data we can use. And I thought we did a lot of mergers, a lot of divestitures in the airline industry. Let's look at the airline industry, because there are data sets. I can see there is, and the honest answer was, no, Tommaso, we know that what we did, we screwed up. But let's find an industry where instead something from 20 years ago that everybody, and we still have the same officials inside the commission here, perhaps. So you want to make sure that something doesn't cause controversy. So let's look at something very small and very old that probably worked. So there is a disincentive there too. The other observation I have is that potentially the US has already a system. The US, when it comes to competition, is an adversarial system, but the agencies can bring in the experts, and then obviously the parties can bring in the experts, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So when, as an example, when there was AT&T Time Warner, that's a gigantic merger. In the end, the experts, Carl Shapiro was, I think, working for the DOJ, and Dennis Carlton, I think, for the parties. In the end, the judge was hearing a debate that, according to the economists, the merger might have increased prices by 50 cents a month. Okay? And that's a mergers we created concentration in media and a lot. And if this is the discussion we're having, we're not going to go very far with the experts. And finally, media, Martin, and usually in conversation, it's more fun to say something more provocative. But your own editor also has some commercial interest. So, as a personal case, currently I'm very much against an ongoing merger between Google and Fitbit, because I think it's not good that a company such as Google also enters with knowledge about our privacy, our health data, and may enter the insurance market, etc. And I've written some economic ideas on why I think, and I have no economic interest at stake. I'm not working for anybody. I contacted and I wrote an op-ed for a newspaper which is very close to you. And this newspaper, which is very close to you, said, well, thank you very much, Tommaso, but this topic is not particularly interesting for us. A few days later, the same newspaper published another op-ed where they were referring to a top economist, which is Halverian, and they even omitted to say that Halverian is, for the past 20 years, the chief economist of the Google Corporation. So I had to do a tweet online to denounce it, and finally, they said that the chief economist of Google says that. So there is a problem also with the newspapers because they're very close to particular people and they want to hear what they want to hear.
So to go back to some of the CSR issues that came up, I'm going to call on Rebecca Henderson to ask some questions. And then just to foreshadow, we're going to bring in Luigi and Anat to talk again about these issues that are all important in many of our minds about the role of academics. But Rebecca?
Paul, thank you very much. And my thanks to the panelists for an absolutely fascinating conversation. I want to pick up on one of the questions from the audience and a comment that Karthik has now doubled down on twice. Karthik suggests that in business schools, for example, we should teach individual managers that they have responsibilities, that how they behave has very important implications for the health of the society. And my question to the panelists is, why should we not also ask this of corporations? Both this morning and yesterday, I had the sense that the panelists and participants often had a view of corporations as completely amoral, doing anything they can to drive profitability, basically pathological creatures that are out of control. And I do not contest for a moment that many corporations are indeed behaving like this, nor do I suggest that corporations who say, oh, we care about the long term are necessarily meaning. But I wonder whether it would make sense to insist that corporations take their responsibilities to the broader systems in which they're embedded seriously. This may sound naive or quixotic, but after all, no corporation now says, well, I'm happy to use child labor. I mean, why not? It's really profitable. They have little children, little fingers, great manual dexterity. Very few corporations would say we don't care a nut about safety. It isn't important. It's much cheaper to run dangerous. There are examples of where normative expectations on corporations do change behavior. And let me add to that I would suggest that we have a collective action problem here, that the corporations are contributing to the accelerating decline of the institutions that maintain capitalism. And so there's at least a collective action to act better. Why don't we hold them to it? Why don't we try and create that focal point of, really destroying the regulatory process and the democratic process? I mean, it's just not a good idea. So I'm just curious why the panelists are so clear that like, nah, forget that, not even worth trying.
So I'm happy to go first on this, and then Sarah, Tommaso, do jump in. So Rebecca, from my perspective, I think there are two reasons why I remain sort of skeptical on that front. The first I'd say is to do with competition, and particularly with rising global competition from firms in China, India, and elsewhere, where if you look at, for instance, how the Reliance Group is behaving in India, the Reliance Group is very quickly becoming the largest conglomerate in every industry in India. It is just absolutely, sort of embodying the rapacious capitalism of John Rockefeller. And Ambani is a brilliant businessman in the same sense as John Rockefeller. And quite frankly, American businesses and British businesses have to compete with the Reliance Group. They have to compete with the equivalents that will come out of China and elsewhere in Africa, et cetera. And so the forces of competition are going to keep corporations focused on the bottom line in a way that, I think makes any sort of effort in this regard limited. So this is not to say, and this brings me to my second point, this is not to say, and I completely agree with you, that corporations have an important role to play and that they have played an important role. In fact, an area which is deeply personal to me, where I think corporations have led on well ahead of public opinion, is gay marriage. And it was the corporate world that actually led the transformation of American public opinion, was not politicians. So, and I'm deeply personally grateful to corporations for having done that. But I think that the cases of that are quite limited. And I think that sort of on this second point, that, look, there will be some issues where the corporate purpose will be aligned with doing the right thing. And in those cases, absolutely, we should celebrate and encourage them. But I don't think that that can happen to the detriment of rebuilding state capacity, for instance. And I don't think that that can happen in the same way that will allow us perhaps to ignore the kind of competitive pressures and forces that the Ambanis and others will have on the way the Unilevers have to behave, or so my sense is that any kind of impact or action by corporations in this space will be limited. So who's going to fill in the gaps then? And that's really where I start. Yeah.
Let me jump in, Rebecca. That is a terrific question. And I want to say I have no interest here in letting corporations off the hook with the focus that we've been discussing. I like your idea of figuring out a way in which corporations can understand that they are in essence disabling their enablers. And it's, that this relationship obviously between the regulatory state and the firm is one that I would argue, like you, is not being, the firms themselves are not understanding essentially what their purpose is if they're going after their enablers, so to speak, right? Their regulatory bodies. But I also would not be letting the agencies, the regulatory agencies, off the hook so easily. Yeah. You see, and it reminded me, this question reminds me of something that happens typically in the bank merger context. So, two large banks essentially merging, the Fed has to weigh in on whether or not it serves the public interest. That's one of the factors that the Bank Merger Act requires the regulators to look at. Does this serve the public? Does this merger serve the public interest? And it's interesting to watch the regulators in action as they look at what the meaning is of that part of the statutory evaluation. So in one context, I recall saying, okay, we've got these two banks merging. What is the public rationale for the merger? And the people come back to me at the staff of the regulatory body at the Fed, and they say, well, we're going to ask the banks, the two banks that are merging, we're going to ask them what the public interest is. And I said, well, is that how we do this? We essentially turn this back to the agencies, or I'm sorry, to the firms themselves that are the applicants. That's what this is about. You see, so there is a responsibility here in the public sector, in the public realm itself. These questions, as I see them, just are getting immediately pushed back into the, into the firms themselves, which then become the ones making the determination, and they come back and they say, yes, it's actually, this merger is in the public interest. End of, period, end of inquiry. That can't be right either.
One observation, Rebecca, I'm very old-fashioned in this respect, and my answer is, I think corporations and firms should do what they do best, which is, run their business, make profits, and if this means also getting close to some sustainable goals to differentiate themselves, that's all fine to me. And government should do two things. Okay, government should set the rules, impose fines. We never think about the fines, which are often too ridiculous. So in the famous antitrust cases in Google, the highest fine was about $5 billion in Google Android, in a market which is worth about $150 billion a year. Okay, so a year per year. That's so it's almost. So I'm Italian. Okay, and when I was in Italy, I was a very lousy driver. When I came to London, I started becoming a law-abiding citizen, but not because I was a new man, but because I knew that as soon as I would speed up, somebody would actually catch me. So I took a couple of fines, and that was enough. So we need to do that. We don't do enough of that. And also there are externalities. The other role for government is to understand the externalities, positive and negative. Make sure that if there are positive externalities, you put people together and talk. The risk I currently see in my very narrow bubble of competition policy is that there is a discussion where the big corporations want to talk to governments in order to all of a sudden deliver sustainable goals for society, which in practice means relaxing once again antitrust rules. And there I am very skeptical. Okay, I think we have not enforced enough. So in a sense, BlackRock goes to Davos in Switzerland and they say, yes, that's what we do. We have passive investors. And I find it very strange that passive investors can be active only for good stuff. And when it's for bad stuff, instead they remain very, very passive. So at least we have to be symmetric in the treatment of those things. But I'm a bit skeptical when, again, the discussion is done only by among the big guys.
So thank you. I may get criticized for taking the conversation to a very interesting place, but a little bit beyond what we're talking about in thin political markets. But actually, of course, it is quite related because we're talking about the incentives there. So I now want to ask my partner in crime, Anat Admati, to come on the screen and ask a question about capture.
Thank you, Paul. This was an amazing panel, so thank you. John Levin yesterday said that Cassie, the initiative that is organizing this with others is 4 years old. Well, it's sort of 2 years old, but in the 2 years prior to that, Sarah Bloom Raskin was among our first visitors. And she and other policymakers who came were begging economists and others around the school and around Stanford to input into policy unconflicted opinions. And I've been in this. So what my experience was sort of similar to Tommaso in that even though FT is among the best, recruiting 20 academics to write an unconflicted letter to policymakers in the G20 resulted in the academics being put in the letter section and city CEO taking the space in the opinion page. And every time I would say something in a paper, there was a lobbyist saying something later. So I never could get the the last word. So that's about the media, but we need the media so desperately. So definitely, you know, I want to say the FT's among the heroes there, both investigative reporting and otherwise. The problem is really the academics, and as just my tribe. I mean, everybody can look at their own tribe and the incentives. So the question is, you know, academics in nonprofit, sometimes publicly funded institutions, how can we change the norms of ourselves to push back? And then how do we deal with the policymakers who oftentimes, when I met Sarah Bloom Raskin when she was at the Fed, had people more involved directly than her in regulation, refusing to engage with things that they didn't find convenient. So regulatory capture, political capture, and the power struggles, and then the lack of incentives and any in academia have been a huge problem I've encountered in the last decade that was just really, you know, like Tommaso, just very changed my perspective on a lot of things. So what can you say about both regulatory capture and about what academic institutions can do to change our own incentives to make us more engaged? And, you know, that includes publication. Tommaso already talked about that.
Sarah, Karthik, do you have a positive note to end on before we go to break?
I would just say that, first of all, this has been an extraordinary conversation, and thank you for keying it up. And it is one that is going to require continuous attention and work. This should not be a drop in the bucket kind of approach. I would like to see this idea of thin political markets as they apply to complex, esoteric policy-making approaches brought to some list of pragmatic solutions. So I think this is important, and I hope it's the beginning of a long stream of conversation. Again, you know, the ultimate thing from my perspective to remember here is that we are going to have suboptimal solutions as long as we don't fix these issues. We are going to have policies that become flawed, that are not credible, that essentially detach government from the will of the people in ways that underwrite, you know, that erode trust. So the consequences of not getting this right, I think, are significant. And I'll stop there.
Great. A final positive word from me, and I'll say that you know, as at my school, I play a role in teaching and in leading on teaching across the school. And I can say that there's nothing that really energizes me more toward this mission than the teaching role that we have with our students, because they are, of course, the people who are going to go on and change the world. And if we take our teaching more seriously as academics, I think we'll be focused more on the real problems in the real world.
So I want to thank Sarah, Karthik, and Tommaso. You can see the advantage that we have in basically breaking down silos, bringing people with experience and with disciplines to comment on these things.